In this video, I'll start with some basic principles, build on those to show some more advanced ideas, and then demonstrate how I might apply these principles in a piece by Chopin. Let's compare two ways of playing a simple C major 5-finger pattern. They both kind of work, but clearly the second one is much more efficient. In the first clip, my fingers started out pretty far from the keys. In the second, they're all set up before I even play the first note, and my whole hand is relaxed. The distance my fingers travel after releasing is also much smaller in the second clip. Another difference is how I'm generating the movement. In the first clip, my wrist is pretty much fixed in place, and most of the motion comes from the fingers. In the second clip, I'm using a subtle forearm rotation. The fingers barely bend at all, primarily just at the joint where they meet the rest of the hand. Here's a side view. When I'm practicing technique, I'm choreographing the movements I'm going to use to play the passage. Part of this involves deciding where I want to place my fingers on each key. Here's another 5-finger pattern, this time in F major. Now I've got one black key instead of all white keys, but this simple change affects my entire hand position. I have to lift my wrist slightly and slide my hand a bit forward to accommodate the shorter, higher black key. This might seem obvious in isolation, but I see a lot of beginners playing their F major scales kind of like this. That big lunge to the B flat is really inefficient and seriously cuts into my control of the sound and ability to play fast. To avoid this, I try to think gesturally and always consider my entire hand position. The inefficient lunge comes from thinking about one note at a time. But if I've got the entire gesture in mind, I'm quickly going to be able to find a better hand position. If I want to continue past the B flat to play the entire scale, there are really only two gestures, or hand positions, that I need to think about. This one and this one. The next step is figuring out how to combine them. I know I want to start out in a hand position that looks something like this, and I want to end up in a position that looks something like this. I also want to avoid sudden movements, so I need to find a way to move fluidly from the first position into the second. The key here is the wrist. As I'm playing the first gesture, my wrist is already making its way up to the next position. By the time I land with my thumb on the C, my whole hand has shifted up, and I'm ready to play the rest of the scale. Every time I move my hand, I'm creating momentum. This can either be a help or a hindrance, depending on how my gestures flow together. In the F major scale, shifting from the first position to the second created a bit of momentum to the right. If I want to finish the octave, I can ride that momentum to the top of the scale. But if I want to turn around and come back down, I need to redirect it in the opposite direction. To do this, I make a little circle with my wrist and loop back around. This way, I'm always going with the momentum instead of fighting it. Okay, now let's look at how I'd apply these principles in a piece. Here's a passage from Fantaisie-Impromptu. First, I need to work out my fingerings, which I do by considering how I want to group notes into hand positions. These are the 4 hand positions I came up with. For the first group, I'm using my strongest fingers, 1, 2, and 3. For the second group, I'm using 1, 2, 4, and 5. An argument could be made for 1, 2, 3, 5, since 3 is stronger and easier to control than 4, but I prefer 4 for a couple of reasons. One is that I just used 3 to play the A, so it would have farther to travel to get to the C sharp than finger 4. The other is that this hand position puts a nasty stretch between 2 and 3, whereas the stretch between 2 and 4 allows my hand to stay more relaxed. Okay, to be fair, I wrote the script before I actually tried the passage, and when I went to record it, I was less convinced that 4 is actually a better fingering, because afterwards I was struggling to get my third finger up to the D sharp on time for beat 3. Putting finger 3 on C sharp brings it closer a little sooner, making it easier to keep going up to the D sharp. Usually when there are multiple viable fingering choices, there are pros and cons to each. If I were actually to learn this piece, I'd probably practice both fingerings and decide later which one works best for me. For the third group, I use 1, 2, and 3 again, and for the last group, I use 1, 2, 3, 5. This time, my third finger only needs to slide from the D sharp up to the E, so the distance traveled is less of a concern, especially considering my hand is already traveling to the right, so the momentum will help carry my finger up to the E. And the stretch between 2 and 3 isn't as bad here either. When I combine the gestures, my wrist leads the way. My fingers are staying close to the keys, so they don't have to move far to produce a sound. My wrist travels slowly but steadily to the right, allowing the momentum to carry me into each hand position with little effort. At the top of the gesture, my hand keeps moving even after I've played the last note. This way I can loop back around and harness that momentum to start the next phrase. Okay, parting thoughts. Technique is movement. I see a lot of beginners and intermediate pianists trying to brute force their way through challenging passages, but if you can find ways to make things more efficient and maybe even easy, it shouldn't take too much strength or effort to play even some pretty difficult music. Anytime you're struggling with technique, I'd recommend examining your movement, trying to find ways to make things more efficient before resorting to muscling your way through. Another takeaway is that good technique requires a bird's eye view. Everything from fingering choices, to wrist position, to hand placement, to figuring out how you're going to flow from one position to the next is informed by looking at the passage as a whole. So if you find that the music that you're working on is hard enough that you have to do a lot of reading note by note, or that just trying to figure out what the notes are supposed to be is taking most of your focus, you might benefit from working on some easier music and analyzing your movements gesturally. The more you play with good technique, the better your habits become, and the less you have to think about these things later on.